In this audio, I'm going to make 3 points that are not related to each other. The first point is this. In earlier audio, I said that there are two kinds of people. I said that there are thinkers and that there are doers. I now believe that thinkers are doers. The difference between doers and so-called thinkers, in other words, the difference between the subclass of the class of doers that we actually refer to as doers and the subclass of the class of doers that we refer to as thinkers, that difference is that thinkers do not acknowledge that the world does not revolve around them. In other words, thinkers are doers who do not acknowledge that this world is not their world. The difference between the thinker and the doer is that the thinker is so intensely narcissistic that he petulantly refuses to play by reality's rules, so he holds himself up in his head where he engages forces of a purely logical nature, where he engages in purely symbolic and logical operations, and where, consequently, his degree of power is limited only by the heft of his intellect. So, it is true that many a doer, an actual doer, in other words, a doer who is operating in the real world, it is true that many such a person is intensely narcissistic. However, in each such case, the doer's narcissism is limited by a fundamentally realistic and therefore non-narcissistic understanding of the world. So yes, Julius Caesar was presumably deeply narcissistic, Donald Trump is presumably narcissistic, and so on and so forth, but such people are narcissistic within the limits set by a fundamentally non-narcissistic conception of reality, or to be more precise, of their relation to reality. And while it is true that many a professor seems meek and friendly and so on and so forth, and while many people will have a lot of difficulty, a lot of resistance to seeing boundless narcissism in the lovable spectacle of the dotty old professor, they are deeply misconceived. The proverbial eccentricities of thinkers are nothing other than expressions of their aggression at the world for not submitting to them. The reason why the genius is so often, or the supposed genius, and also the actual genius, the reason why this sort of person is so deeply eccentric is because he's so deeply antisocial. And yes, it is true that, professors sometimes, or intellectuals sometimes, may seem very meek, and they often live very modestly. They are often, in many ways, people who have a certain humility, but their humility is itself nothing other than boundless narcissism. So, we're all familiar with the stereotype, and it's a stereotype that corresponds to the truth to a large extent. We're all familiar with the stereotype of the great thinker who lives in his tiny, modest little lodging on the hill, his only companions being his books, and who spurns luxury. Yes, that may well all be true, but the reason that the thinker is so often drawn to a life of material modesty, of relative deprivation when it comes to material luxuries, is that he wants to strip all of those things of their meaning. He spurns them because he does not have them, and he wants to have infinite power. And given the fact that he does not have wealth, given the fact that he is not mature enough and non-narcissistic enough, to be quite blunt, to engage the world so as to convert his symbolic dollars into actual dollars, so to speak, given that fact, he has a choice between representing his lack of material wealth to himself as what it is, which is just poverty, or as representing it as hyper wealth. So obviously he chooses to do the latter. And as for his, oftentimes benign appearance, it's simply that. So very little stock is to be put in the fact that doers, real doers, are often deeply narcissistic. In fact, a certain narcissism is obviously going to be a precondition for ambition of any kind. And equally little stock, in fact, even less stock perhaps, is to be put in the fact that for whatever reason, people find it hard to believe that the lovable eccentric is actually deeply, unfathomably narcissistic in a particularly infantile way. And I do stress that the eccentricities and dottinesses of the thinker, of the bow tie wearing professor, are simply expressions of utter narcissism. They are his way of telling the world that it is his world, not theirs. It is his way of spurning and of expressing contempt for a reality that has yet to submit to him as it should, in his view. And the fundamentally infantile, narcissistically infantile nature of the thinker is oftentimes obscured by the following things. One is that people associate a high degree of learnedness and a high degree of intelligence, a high degree of cultivated learnedness. People associate that with a high degree of maturity, and that is a fatal mistake. Maturity is an emotional thing. Learnedness is an intellectual thing. Okay, so maturity is about emotional development. Learnedness is about cognitive development. But there's another consideration, which is that the thinker, even though he is in some sense very infantile and narcissistic, the thinker is often able to put his abilities to practical use. He can often be very useful. He can invent things. He can, even if he is doing some discipline that seems completely and totally theoretical, such as analytic philosophy, he can often be incredibly useful, unbelievably useful when it comes to solving practical problems. And be it noted that Adam Smith was a philosophy professor. David Hume, who did incredibly good work in economics, was a philosopher. Von Mises was a philosopher. Marx was a philosopher. He was not a good philosopher. He was not a good economist, but he is still an illustration of the point I'm making. Keynes was a philosopher. Alfred Marshall was a philosopher and a physicist. So you get the idea. So the thinker, at least when he's very, very good at what he does, and when he's a thinker of a certain kind, but the thinker can often convert his purely intellectual capital into real. He can actually make this conversion. He can actually, at certain specific junctures, convert all of these logical operations of his into actual operations. He can be of use. And that obscures the fundamentally narcissistic and autistic and self-involved and infantile nature of the thinker. It obscures the fact that the thinker is not a different sort of person at bottom from the doer. The difference is not a categorical difference. It is not an existential difference. The difference is simply that the thinker is a crypto doer. He is a doer who is so narcissistic that he refuses to take that first step of acknowledging that the world does not revolve around him. So I began this podcast by saying that I was going to make 3 points, but point number 1 took quite a while, so I will make the next 2 points in the next 1 or 2 podcasts. Over and out.